This is the shore, and the waves keep crushing in.
But in a different row. Okay. Mr. Norte, you were born 1964 in Rotterdam. Why did you decide to go to the army?
It was actually a very easy choice because when I was younger, we still had a conscript army. So most young men were supposed to get into the army. Say 75% didn't want to get into the army and they tried to get away from it, from their conscription. But I didn't want to do that. I quite liked the idea to get into the army, and I just went into the army for my number, but I did it laughingly because I looked forward to be in the army, and it proved every bit its worth that I thought it would be. I mean, I thought it really enjoyable to be in the army. I had a chance to opt for special forces, which I did, and that had been some sort of dream for a long time. So I had a very good time in the army when I was young.
But how was your training? Were you aware what was going to come?
Well, those days, we're talking the early 80s, we still had an enemy in the east. We were trained to fight the Russians should they want to come over and conquer Europe. So there was a whole different perspective on being a soldier than there is now. I mean, if you get into the army right now, you're talking about possibly serving in Afghanistan or Iraq or whichever other country. Back then, we had the Cold War still going on, so we were trained to fight the Russians instead of insurgents or whatever you want to call the enemy right now. So it was a whole different ball game. It was a different kind of army. We had different perspectives than armies have now. It was a completely different time. I mean, we're talking about 40 years ago. And as I said, we were still focusing on the Russians instead of focusing on minority groups that we fight now in say the Middle East.
Was that a subject while training, in your training, the Russians, or I don't understand, was the training harder, or did your comrades have more ambition because it was such a close enemy, or I don't know?
No, we actually didn't see the Russians as a real enemy because no one really believed that the Russians would ever come over and try to do something stupid. So we were not really afraid of Russians, and we didn't really see an enemy that we were training for to fight one day. It was just the army, and we liked that. Training was actually pretty hard because those days we didn't have all the circumstances that are being in play right now. I mean, you were just a number. You did what you had to do, and you went through your training, and no one cared about possible accidents or I mean, it's unimaginable right now that you would climb into a say 20-meter high tower unsecured and do whatever you had to do there. I mean, it's we live in a different world with people that can't challenge people right now as we did it 40 years ago. I mean, it's the world has changed. So training was rough, but well, it was lovely at the same time. But soldiers were made to do things that are impossible these days because we have psychologists watching over our shoulders, and we have doctors, and I mean, people seem to be a little more vulnerable today than they were like 40 years ago. So I'm actually very glad that I lived through those days and live still through the days that lots of things were possible that are impossible right now.
So you didn't have psychologists and doctors there?
No, there was, as I said, we were just numbers, and you went through your training or you quit. So it was a very easy challenge. We started in my training. We started out with 200 men, and 36 came in after 4 months of training, and that was the way it was. And there was no talk, there was no support. You just quit or you didn't quit, and that was a very easy choice. And I there was perspective on life that I enjoyed.
Mr. Norte, you ended your career as a captain, and how did it? Then you had your first deployment in Afghanistan in 2006. How was that? How did they tell you something about Afghanistan, what to expect, or was it totally different arriving there than you got told?
No, very little. I mean, as far as Afghan culture was concerned, most military personnel had a visit to a mosque in Holland, in the Netherlands, to some sort of adapt to culture, which of course was completely ridiculous. They learned to take their boots off in order to get into a mosque, which is in fact ridiculous because soldiers have no business in mosques. So it was, but that was about the culture that we were being taught on. I did my own research. I tried to learn as much Pashto as I could. I found some child books and things, so I tried to get like 10 words under my belt with every day passing. I investigated the Afghan culture. I invested their history. I investigated a phenomenon called Taliban, and so on and so on. So I came into Afghanistan quite prepared, and I think I knew a lot about the country and about the history of the country.
The Dutch army is a religious army?
No, it's not. It's just you can have whichever religion you want, but you talked about the preparation, and if you go to a country like Afghanistan, there's a lot of preparation to do. You have to know the culture of a country, you have to know the history, and we were not taught about those subjects. The only thing they did, people that went to Afghanistan had they visited, it was obligatory, a mosque for a day, and that was the only introduction to Afghan culture that they got, which I think is a ridiculous thing. If you send troops to Afghanistan, you should at least, I mean, take like 6-8 weeks to prepare them for what they are going to see when they get into Afghanistan. We're talking about 19-year-old boys, and you have to properly teach them on different cultures and histories of countries that they are going to go to. And they lacked all that kind of training. They just had their standard infantry training and went to Afghanistan, which I think is not a good thing.
How was you arrived in, you did live in Camp Holland. How was this?
That was wonderful. When I came into Afghanistan in 2006, I was well ahead of the Dutch troops. They came only a few months later. So I was sent there with another captain. We came into Afghanistan, into Uruzgan, by the two of us to do some reconnaissance. And when I arrived there, it was originally Camp Rippy, but I arrived. There was a beautiful camp in the middle of Uruzgan, close to the city of Tarinkot, and that was wonderful. I was able to get out of the camp immediately, started to visit people, started to walk around the camp's surroundings, and I encountered a wonderful Afghan world, people living in peace. It was a beautiful world, and I felt quite happy that I was able to enjoy that world for a couple of months until the Dutch troops arrived.
how were the Afghans? What did you talk to them?
Those, I mean, I had a lot of respect for those people. I instantly sort of, I mean, that's a stupid word, but I instantly sort of loved those people. They lived a very rural life, not to our standards. I mean, hard to understand that life. It was a hard life, but I found amazingly friendly and alive people in that part of Afghanistan. They just went about their lives in a fascinating way, and I felt very happy to be able to be a part of that for at least a couple of months.
But your job was there, intelligence officer.
Yeah.
What did you tell them? It's like, hi, I'm Mr. Norte. I'm from the Netherlands, and I'm going to bring freedom.
No, I
I'm
didn't.
intelligence officer.
No, I didn't tell him that. The only thing I did, because I had no fear for Afghanistan or the life that I would encounter there. So what I did, I dressed differently than regular soldiers do. I just put on my flak jacket. I didn't take any luggage with me. I went out of the gates with a Kalashnikov instead of a Marco rifle. I wore a turban around my head, and I just went out and I started to change money, for example, to get Afghan money, which wasn't there at the time. So I bought rupees, and I went out to go shopping. I bought tea, and I bought things that I could live on, like figs and nuts, and just as a tourist, I walked around and I did my shopping. I did whatever I wanted to do, and that way I came into contact with people. I found people able to speak some English. I found people willing to laugh about the stupid Pashto I spoke, but I mean, we built up some sort of rapport with each other and build a connection. I mean, Tarinkout is a small village, and if like a foreigner like me walks the streets, it's they know you instantly like something weird. So it was very easy to set up a connection with those people. I met some militia leaders. I met different kind of people. Just talked to them, sat with them, tried to make some sort of language, and at least tried to make myself known in order to feel what lived among those people. I mean, those first months, I knew I would never be able to fully understand them, but at least I could get a feel of what was going on in the streets. I could get a feel of fear that possibly was there, which wasn't. That was it. I just walked around and tried to be among people, like maybe as a tourist.
That was a mission, and counterinsurgent mission, or you were undercover? What did you say?
No. Nothing. I mean, we were talking May 2006. There was only one American platoon in the neighborhood, and there was a battalion of Afghan National Army in Camp Ripley. But that battalion was as big as a company, so it was a rather small group of Afghan soldiers. There was one American platoon. I hooked up with the American platoon and traveled through the countryside with them. I hooked up with the ANA, with the Afghan National Army, and they brought me wherever I wanted to go. And that part, I walked the streets by myself. I did not have a specific mission. My only mission was to do some sort of reconnaissance, to get a picture of what was going on in Afghanistan. And I was supposed to do that, for example, with that American platoon. But when I was out with the Americans, I discovered the area to be so peaceful that I decided to get out on my own, which would lead me to more understanding of the Afghan life, would lead me to a better contact with people. And it worked. I mean, I didn't ask for permission. It wasn't a task that I got. I mean, I was free to do whatever I wanted those first months. And I took that opportunity to mingle with the people and to get as much information about their way of living as I could get. And that was simply a wonderful experience. And I would never have gotten that experience if I hadn't traveled ahead of the Dutch troops. I mean, if I had gotten into Afghanistan with the Dutch troops, my life would have been different. But I came there with only one colleague. So we were just two Dutch soldiers among, well, nothing. There were no Dutch soldiers at that time in the area. So I took my chances and I went out as much as I could, and I tried to mingle with the local people. And that was the best way to get as much information as I could. So I took that opportunity. Why would I tell people that are free that I was going to bring them freedom?
But they all knew that you were Dutch forces.
No, they had no clue, because what we forgot was to inform people about what we were going to do. Those people had no clue what was going on. Those people were just living their lives. They knew there was a military base close to their village. They knew there was a big military airport close to their village. It was all part of Camp Ripley, but they had no clue what we were doing there. They saw some Humvees driving around. There were some, I mean, we didn't inform those people, and I didn't inform them either. I was just walking their streets, trying to be as polite as I could be, and trying to get a feel of the lay of the land. That was all I was doing, because I knew that pretty shortly those Dutch troops would be arriving, and I had a feeling that they would be looking for an enemy, and that they would be looking for, let's say, war, and it wasn't there. There was no reason for war. There was a very peaceful ambience. There were peaceful people living a peaceful life. And I wanted to gather as much information about that peaceful life as I could, in order to tell the Dutch people when they arrived, to tell Dutch military that there was nothing to fear in Uruzgan, that there was a regular, calm, quiet life going on. And I hoped to be able to convince them that we could easily settle in, and that we could easily find our way among Afghan people, instead of going in as an occupying army. And I failed completely.
How did you see there a lot of Russian equipment around, or old tanks? Russian equipment, I don't know, old Kalashnikovs, or
well, there were some tanks. There weren't many, but I found some. They were completely washed away in riverbeds, and there were some remains of, for example, Russian BMPs and things like that, which was, of course, interesting to see. But it was like seeing the Normandy beaches, worn out tanks, but not many. But there were a few BMPs and things like that. That apart, most people, like say 1 in 5 people, they walk the streets with armed with a Kalashnikov. And that was something that worried me, because I knew that the Dutch troops were pretty soon coming in, and they would be scared about armed people. And I was very afraid that they would react in a wrong way to those armed people, because you have the right to carry a firearm in Afghanistan. There's no law that prohibits it. But I was quite afraid that the Dutch soldiers, being 19 years of age, wouldn't appreciate the sight of armed people. So when I was there, and when the Dutch army was still not there, I started to confiscate Kalashnikovs, and I gave people a small card. And on that card, I had someone written a Pashto text, and that text said that they could recollect their firearm when they could show a proper permit. On the other side of the card, I'd written in English, this guy is here to reclaim his Kalashnikov. If he is able to properly identify himself, please give him back his Kalashnikov. So I went out for like 3, 4, 5 days, came back every night in Camp Ripley with 4 or 5 or 6 Kalashnikovs. The result was that within 3 days, everyone left his Kalashnikov at home, and most people recollected their Kalashnikovs in Camp Ripley. But at least I'd send out a small message that please leave your weapon at home. And I did that on purpose, because I was very afraid that the Dutch troops would not be able to properly react to the sight of firearms. I mean, you have to get used to that in Afghanistan, because it's just a part of life there. but I knew that those people were too untrained and too young to properly appreciate the situation. So I thought it wise to try to convince people to leave their firearms at home. They were still wearing pistols under their tumban, so I knew they were still armed, but at least we didn't see anyone carrying a Kalashnikov, which helped to keep the situation stable for the first few months after the Dutch came in.
I mean, they dealt with the Russians for a while. But how was it when your comrades arrived? How it changed? Yeah, what changed?
Firstly, nothing much changed because the Dutch, in the first 8 weeks of after their arrival in Camp Holland, I mean, it used to be Camp Ripley, but when the Dutch came in, they baptized it Camp Holland. The original Camp Ripley was like a manly camp that consisted of tents, but the Dutch rebuilt that. They made it a fully armored camp. So they did not sleep in tents, but they slept in armored containers to be as safe as they could be. And the first 8 weeks of their mission, they couldn't leave the gates because there was something wrong with the vehicles. The vehicles were supposed to be equipped with some sort of equipment that was missing. So those vehicles were not able to leave the gates, which meant that there was an occasional foot patrol. But other than that, for the first 2.5 months, nothing much happened. It was only afterwards that when the full equipment came in, that they were able to get out on patrols. But one of the mistakes they made is that they made their patrols too big. The smallest unit of action, the smallest unit that was allowed to leave the gates was a platoon. While, for example, the Americans that I worked with before the Dutch came in, they operated in single Humvees or in groups of 2 Humvees, which is a lot easier for the people in Afghanistan to accept than a whole platoon rolling by. So that was quite a mistake they made. They stopped their foot patrols and they started to roll out in patrols as big as a platoon. So you have to imagine like 6, 7, 8 vehicles leaving the gate and well, slowly driving through the countryside, which sends, in my point of view, a completely ridiculous message, because you have to appreciate a certain situation and you have to know instantly, especially when you have an intelligence officer on the ground, that it is safe to travel in small groups. But the Dutch didn't trust that and they started operating in rather large groups. And by doing that, they created their own resistance in Afghanistan.
Did you get attacked?
Well, not really attacked, because you have to be very careful with that word. I mean, if I use the word attack, you expect like, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 people running towards you, firing a Kalashnikov, a knife between their teeth, which is not the truth in that part of Afghanistan. It was a very quiet area. There were no drugs. There was no poppy harvest. There was just some transport of drugs. So there was little trouble in Uruzgan, drugs related. There was no Taliban influence because there was at that time no Taliban no active Taliban in Afghanistan. So what you create when you just drive around the countryside in large units that go on the pace of an engineer with a metal detector, because the Dutch were so scared of IEDs that they had an engineer walking in front of a platoon with a metal detector, which means that the speed of your platoon is completely dependent on that single walking engineer. So you have to try to imagine the point of view of an Afghan youth. I mean, he's living there in his rural area. We call that the green zone, and all he sees is a passing column of like 5, 6, 7 vehicles on the pace of a walking man. That inspires that guy to fire a couple of shots at that platoon. I mean, it's a normal thing in Afghanistan to do that, and you have to react to that proportionally, which in most cases is that you better don't react at all. But whenever that happened, whenever a shot was fired at a Dutch unit, they responded with an enormous amount of violence. And because of those reactions, things spiraled completely out of control. I mean, if someone shoots at you, you could call it an attack, but it's not the proper name for what happens. What happens is that someone shoots at you. That could be very dangerous. That could be very frightening. That could be, but as a soldier, you have to be able to live with that if you operate in a country like Afghanistan. You either behave very manly and you roll around the countryside in small units and you have nothing to fear, or at least you communicate with people that you fear nothing, or you do what the Dutch did and drive around in large groups of military personnel on a small, on a low speed, and then you invite people literally to shoot at you. But you have to put that in perspective. There were every now and then like 2 or 3 or 5 shots fired. That is not an attack. Those shots were fired from distances of 500 meters, 1,000 meters. Sometimes an RPG was fired. That was it. Okay, what I was willing to say, if you react to those few shots, although you don't even know whether or not they are aimed at you, if you react out of proportion, then, well, a spiral of violence starts, and that is a bad thing. Apart from that, we in a way invited people to dig in IEDs. The way we moved through the countryside invited people to dig in IEDs, while at the same time we could have occupied some higher points in the terrain and keep all roads under permanent observation. If we had done so, no one would have been able to dig in an IED, but we didn't. Those Dutch soldiers were so scared, they wanted to be back at their base every night and sleep there in their armored containers, while I tried to advocate for us to stay outside each night and to occupy certain higher elements of the ground in order to have all roads under observation. And as long as you have a road under observation, no one is able to dig in an IED. But we didn't do that. So we kept encountering IEDs. They were not very professional IEDs, but they were deadly enough. But in that way, we limited our own scope of being productive. And we, as I said before, we created a spiral of violence that was not necessary. If we had operated slightly more manly in Afghanistan, we could have avoided a lot of trouble.
And who did throw those IEDs? The Taliban?
No, it's not proper to call the people that dig in IEDs Taliban. You first have to research whether they are Taliban or not. And as far as I could research what was going on there, we were talking about hooliganism. And that's a difficult word for us to use, because if we talk about hooliganism from a Western perspective, we think about soccer hooligans throwing stones at the police. Quite honestly, an Afghan youth digging in an IED is a hooligan in the same perspective as a soccer hooligan throwing stones at the police. I mean, you have to see things in an Afghan perspective, and if you don't, you lose whatever you do there. So it was their way to prove that they were as brave as their fathers had been, as their grandfathers had been fighting the Russians. There was a surging urge among young people just to demonstrate their braveness, and they used us to demonstrate that braveness. And it would have been easy to counter those attempts that people made to prove themselves brave. It would have been very easy, but we didn't. We labeled every action from Afghan people as a Taliban action, but we had no proof to label that as Taliban. The problem is, if you tell 19-year-old soldiers that they have an enemy called Taliban, they will act in a certain way, in an improper way, because they should have seen our opponents for what they were, and they were simple hooligans. And the only proper name for that could have been OMF, opposing militant forces. But instead of calling them opposing militant forces, we called them Taliban, for which there was no proof. But by calling them Taliban, we created that same circle of that same spiral of violence that we should have avoided, because there was no Taliban in our region. And just by calling our opposition Taliban created a whole different ballgame that should not have been created.
What was the Dutch mission and the mission of your colleagues there to start peacekeeping and building up the Afghanistan or killing the Taliban? Why did Holland go there?
Well, it wasn't reconstruction mission officially, but if you want to reconstruct something, there should be something to reconstruct, and there was nothing to reconstruct in Afghanistan, or at least not in Uruzgan. There was absolutely nothing that we could possibly reconstruct because nothing was damaged. People lived a different life than we live, and for some reason we thought we could make the life better, which you can't. I mean, people have their own pace, people have their own ways of growing, and we could not possibly contribute to that. The only thing we tried to do was build a building and put a sign on it which said school or hospital, but a building with no tables, with no teachers, with no plan is not a school, that's a building. And we put up other buildings like buildings that said hospital, but a hospital, or let's say a building without a bed, without a doctor, without any plans is not a hospital, it's a building. But well, that's basically what we did. We were there to reconstruct, but because of our wrong approach to the area, our wrong approach to the people, and our wrongly labeling some people as Taliban, a spiral of violence erupted, and there was no way to stop that. So we created our own violence, we created our own enemy, which wasn't officially there, but it ended in like huge bombardments on settlements. We created a horrible situation for the Afghan people just because we were not capable to do a proper job. We went into Afghanistan with 2 young soldiers. They were effectively rewarded for violence because we introduced some sort of badge, a fighting badge. So a soldier that had been in a fight could earn a certain badge, which means that every 19-year-old soldier that left the gates was in search of his combat badge. Compare that to the CIB that the Americans have, with the difference that you don't get a CIB, a combat infantry badge, for fighting. You get a CIB because you operate outside of gates, which is a huge difference. So the Dutch tried to create a badge for people that operated outside of the gates. 80% of Dutch military personnel stayed in Camp Holland, and only 20% operated outside the gates. So logically, they wanted to create a badge, something you could wear on your uniform to separate yourself as an outgoing soldier from those base tigers. I understand that. But if you call it a fighting badge, if you get it, once you get into a fight, you can easily imagine that 19-year-old soldiers start to look for fights, which is exactly what they did. They tried to start fights whenever they could in order to earn their equivalent to the combat infantry badge that the Americans had. And all those things together, not even talking about interpreters that didn't speak Pashto, but all those things together created a highly explosive situation for which we, the Dutch, were responsible, not the Afghan people.
What are fighting tigers?
No, I said base tigers.
Base tigers.
With base tigers, I mean those people that never leave a camp. I mean, it's a regular situation. If you have like 100 soldiers, normally 80 of those soldiers stay on a base. They never get out of the base, and 20%, so 20 soldiers of each 100, operate outside of the base. So in order to establish a visible difference between those two, once they get back to, for example, Holland, you give those soldiers operating outside of a base, you give them a reward. You give them something they can wear on their uniform that says, okay, I was in Afghanistan or wherever, and I operated outside the base. I mean, the Americans have a word for it. They call the people that stay on the base, I call them base tigers. The Americans call them Rams, real rear echelon motherfuckers. I mean, sorry for the word, but that's what they call them. That's the people that stay behind. And to make a difference between the people that stay behind and the people that actually operate outside a base, there is a badge that you can earn. And the Americans call it the CIP, the Combat Infantry Badge. You get that once you operate outside of a base. The Dutch tried to initiate the same badge, but they gave it for fighting, which is stupid. You should not reward a soldier for fighting. You can possibly reward him if he has been in a fight and he behaved well. Okay, give him an award, that's fine. But don't tell him, once you get into a fight, I give you a reward. It's a different approach to the matter, which accelerates violence, because people go in search of their fight in order to get that badge that distinguishes them from other soldiers. So it's a very wrong decision to create, let's say, to create a medal for soldiers once they fight. It's ridiculous, because you make them look for fights, and that's exactly what they did in Afghanistan. The Dutch soldiers, they looked for fights. Well, they shouldn't have been. They should have looked for projects to start. They should have looked for people to help, but they didn't. They were constantly looking for people to shoot at, which is a completely ridiculous approach. And the Dutch army, the higher echelons, they provoked that kind of behavior.
And what projects, and would you have as a sergeant, could you just start a project? What would the project be? Building us?
No, you couldn't start a project. We had a special team in charge of starting projects. There was the PRT. Every army has one. That is a provincial reconstruction team. And there were just a few guys, and the platoons were supposed to bring those guys to the people, and then those people would start the proper projects. But the Dutch military didn't want to enter the green zones, so they never got into any green zones. They never got into the areas where people actually live. They drove around them. They stayed in the desert, drove around the green zones, and tried to invite a village elder to meet with them on a hilltop, and then discuss the beautiful projects that would soon be started in their villages, which as well is a ridiculous approach, because what was the end effect? The end effect was that a heavily armored platoon stood on a hilltop, then with loudspeakers, they tried to invite a village elder to their position. Well, sometimes they came to their position, and then some talks started between PRT personnel, a village elder, and an interpreter. That interpreter was usually not fully capable to speak Pashto, so the whole discussion was a strange discussion to start with. And all the Dutch people then did was promise to create a highway, promise to build a new mosque, promise to build a hospital, and that is ridiculous. You either build something or you don't, but you can't keep promising people to build something and then walk away and 10 minutes later shoot at everything you can shoot at. It's a completely ridiculous situation. And in the end, we didn't build zip. I mean, we talked about building, I don't know what, but I never saw it. I saw the most ridiculous projects that we would have laughed at in the Western world. I saw, for example, shoe boxes or wooden boxes as big as a shoebox floating in water with two moving parts on it, and they were called micro hydro power plants and things like that. It was plain ridiculous, but the Dutch paid a lot of money for that kind of projects, so the Afghans could develop them themselves. They got like amounts of $10,000-$25,000 to further develop their projects. And well, what they did was move to Kandahar or Kabul with their money, and that was it. But we called that projects, and well, it sounds good in the press, but if you're there and you see what's going on, it's kind of ridiculous.
And what did the 80% on the platoon do? Did they bodybuilding, or what were the shops?
Mostly they played bubbles on their computer. I don't know what they did. I mean, they just sit there and waited for time to pass. I don't know. I was quite honestly, I was really surprised to find us working with such a big staff because we didn't need it. I mean, a simple battalion would have been enough to operate, but we had like 800 or 1,000 people at times as staff, guiding us, guiding like 300 people through the terrain, which, in my opinion, was rather ridiculous because I've never understood what we needed such a big staff for.
Did you have staff contract workers like too, like people from Ghana maybe, or just contractors as a platoon staff?
No, we had it was just the Dutch army, and as far as I knew, there were no foreigners involved. We of course worked with some local people that cleaned our dixies and did our laundry and things like that. Things that I think we should have done ourselves, but we had Afghan people do it. Then we had Afghan people guarding the walls of our camps, and that was it. But it was mainly the Dutch, aided by local people.
So Afghanistan has actually that they have minerals, and
they do, but they don't have the means to exploit them, or at least the means they have are limited, which maybe is a good thing. But what they have is opium. I mean, they're the largest producer of the base product of heroin in the world, and that's economically what they live on. But it doesn't make any sense to see Afghanistan on a larger worldwide economic scale, because it's a country where that is divided in smaller parts, and in those smaller parts people just live their rural lives, and they are not very interested in international economics because they don't need to. They don't even have money, and they don't need money. I mean, they live their rural life. They're, as far as I could see, extremely happy, and they are developing, but at their own pace, and they're doing well. They used to be like in the 60s of the last century. Afghanistan was an unbelievably liberated Muslim country. That changed after the Russian invasion and then the say Taliban occupation. But they were still developing back. I mean, their Taliban era was a bit of a setback for that lasted, say, 10, 15 years. But they were recuperating from that and trying to, they were striving back to their original state of freedom. But it took some time, and we should not have mingled in that situation as far as I saw it.
But in Canada, what was the economy there? So you'd have a bakery, you'd have a shoemaker. What would people sell? Weren't there
They were just what I saw was they were just selling their local products. I mean, in Tarankat there was a bazaar which you find on every few square miles in Afghanistan, and on that bazaar where the regular farming products were sold, and some cooking equipment, things like that. You had like stores that were filled with copper kettles and things like that. That was it. It was, as I say, a rural life, and with that rural life came a market. People transported their products to the market and traded them for other products that they didn't have themselves. So if someone produced grain, they traded it for tea, and it was like Europe was living in the Middle Ages, to which, in my opinion, is nothing wrong. I mean, you had a simple bazaar which had a market function, and people traded their goods. They traveled once a month, once a week. I don't know. They traveled with their donkeys to the market, traded their goods, and traveled back home. That was it. And well, we thought we could make that better. And I still, till today, I don't know how we could have made that any better.
So you spent 2 years mainly on patrol and projects. In this time, you started to build up to train the Afghan police. What was the job there?
I had no job in training Afghan police, but there were certain units within the Dutch forces that started to train Afghan men to be police officers. Well, that's another project you can doubt. They just took whoever walked in, they took as a trainee. They didn't check his background, they didn't check his ambitions, they didn't check his agenda, they didn't check anything. He was just given a uniform, he was given a Kalashnikov, he was given a formal paper that said he was a police officer, and he was given a bit of money, and that made him a police officer. That training lasted for 6 weeks. And during that training, those trainees learned to crawl through the dust, and they learned to stop a car. And
so you said, and you write in your book that that was a rather bad idea. Why was this?
Well, first of all, if you get into a country, you have to make sure, a foreign country, you have to make sure you understand the culture, you understand the history, and you understand the political system, that you understand the system of law they abide to. And if you don't, you're well, pissing against the wind, I'm sorry to say so, because you can train police officers in Afghanistan, but if there's no proper police force, if there are no judges, if there is no system of law, what is your aim? What are those police officers going to do? They have no proper job, because the whole system in which a police officer can work does not exist in Afghanistan. They have a completely different juridical system. It doesn't work with police officers. So we can train them to our standards, which is ridiculous, because in Holland, for example, in the Netherlands, if you want to be a police officer, it takes you 4 years of training and study. So how do we think we could possibly train an Afghan man to be a police officer in 6 weeks? It's ridiculous. So it is nothing more than a political aim. It is not a realistic aim. It is in effect, it's ridiculous. But it does well in the press. We're training police officers. But if there's no juridical system, if there is no law people can abide by and that can be enforced by law officers, it's ridiculous what you're doing. So what we did, we took in people from wherever they came, whether they came from Pakistan or from different provinces, we didn't care. Whoever walked in could be trained as a police officer. And that person went through a training of 6 weeks. They ran sort of obstacle courses, they crawled through the dust, they learned how to stop a car and search a car. And then at the end of that so-called training, they were police officers. They were given a Kalashnikov, they were given some money, they were given a uniform, and they were given an identification card that said they were police officers, and that was it. No one controlled or monitored where they went to. They just walked out of the gates, and that was it. And the Dutch reported to their political leaders that they had successfully trained, I don't know how many thousands of Afghan people to be police officers, but we had no idea what they were doing afterwards. Some of those police officers joined local militias. Other of those officers, they just walked home, sold their Kalashnikov for say $400, and that was it. So it's basically a ridiculous mission. I mean, if you want to change the way the law functions in a country, you need decades. You can't enforce that in 4 years' time, especially not if you don't understand the whole basics of another system. And who says that the Afghan system is a bad system, is a system that we should change? I mean, the Afghan people have a system that's called Pashtunwali. It is a social code. They live by that code, and it's a pretty beautiful code. I think that most Western countries would be more beautiful countries if they adopted the Pashtunwali. But instead, we run into Afghanistan and we bring them democracy. And that's never going to work because those people don't understand democracy. They don't have the proper means to install a democracy. They can't even properly vote because there is no system that allows them to vote. So it is a ridiculous point of view to install Western means of living into an Afghan society and to train Afghan people to be police officers is equally ridiculous because there is no police force, there is no hierarchy, there is nothing that looks like a system that we know. So why imply that in a country that is developing on its own pace? Whatever, we trained police officers. Those officers went wherever they went, and lots of them joined local militia. And that was a problem because those local militias could put some more strength on the drug trafficking. Because in Uruzgan, I said before, there was no poppy harvest, but lots of drugs from, for example, Helmand, traveled through the province. And the stronger those local militia got, the more pressure they could put on the drugs trade, the more toll they could demand from the drugs trade. And that created a lot of pressure in our province because we stimulated local militia to with money, with weapons, with freshly trained so-called officers. We stimulated them to put more pressure on the drugs trade, and that well, the effect of that was a strong increase of violence in the province, which we were trying to avoid, but we didn't. We stimulated all that violence.
So is smoking opium a crime? What's the crimes in Afghanistan? I don't know. What was there much crime, or what was the crimes? Was there murder, rape, sexual violence, mafia? I don't know, but
there was nothing. There was a simple rural life. And during the opium season, there were trucks traveling through the province. And the moment those trucks started traveling through the province, there were people, local people, that tried to, sought a bit of an advantage of that drug trade. So they established militias, and they tried to pressure the drugs trade in order to give them some money, in order to give them a part of their drugs, whatever. It was the regular thing that happened every year in the province of Uruzgan. Drugs were transported through the province, and some people tried to have their benefits from that drug smuggling. You can't call it smuggling because it was simply transported in the eyes of Afghan people. So there was a slight increase of violence during the season that drugs were transported through the province. That was all. That had nothing to do with mafia. That had nothing to do with criminality, because there was none. Those people, as I said before, lived according to their own system, which was a good system. And every year, so in June, there was a spike in violence, and it had to do with the drug trade, because there were more drugs traveling through the province and more people tried to to get some money from that drug trade. So if, for example, a pickup truck passed with 20 bags of raw opium, well, they had to pass through checkpoints and give the people manning those checkpoints one bag of opium, and they could continue their traveling. That was the regular thing in Uruzgan. And we disrupted that by training police officers, by giving people weapons, by aiding those people without knowing why we aided them. And so we in that way, we created a lot of violence that should not have been there.
Under which law did the Afghan police operate? The police is the law. Under which law?
Yeah, that's what I said. There is no law and there is no police. We created police, but that is not the Afghan system. The Afghan system is a very simple system. There are people working the fields, farmers, and if for some reason an unstable situation creates itself, then some of those people form a local militia and they stabilize the situation once again. And the uproar in a certain situation always has to do something with the drug trade. So every year, drugs are passing through the province. Some people try to muscle in on that business, and there is a spike of violence. But that's it. Afghan people in the better part of Afghanistan don't need police because there is very little crime. There is a drug trade, but that's not a criminal thing because it's what people live from. So it's not criminal. It's what they do. They farm opium. They harvest opium. They create raw opium out of their poppy. It's what they do. It's not considered criminal in Afghanistan. It's their way of living. It starts to be criminal once the drugs get out of Afghanistan. Then it's all of a sudden it's a criminal offense. But for the Afghan people, it's just a way of living. It has nothing to do with mafia or with criminality or with nothing. They have a simple shura system, and that works perfectly. That's comparable to our democracy. In my view, it's slightly better. And that whole system takes care of criminality. If there is anything, it takes care of disputes. It takes care of basically everything. And you cannot simply walk into Afghanistan and implement a system that we think is a good system. You cannot go there and start training people to be police officers because they have no clue what a police officer is. They don't know that concept. So why enforce it on them?
Did you, while you were there, did you meet any professional fighters or contractors and warline holiday makers?
I mean, on the opposing side, on the Afghan side.
No, yeah, maybe.
No, there were no foreign people in that part of Afghanistan. There were Afghan people living there. Our intelligence channels tried to scare us by giving the false information that there were Chechen people in the region, that there were Bosnian people in the region, but that was all false information, and we never had a confirmation of that, which is logical because no Chechen or no Bosnian had anything to look for in Uruzgan. So it would have been it was a ridiculous proposition that those people should be there, but. Sure, there were intelligence reports that said, oh, there is an influx of Chechens, there is an influx of Bosnian people, which was completely ridiculous because we never saw them. We never saw their way of fighting against us. We never experienced anything that had to do with an influx of foreign fighters in our area. There were no fighters in our area. We had to deal with local hooligans, and that was it.
Before you left, did you see US American contractor companies like Blackwater or?
No, I didn't see them operate in our area. I know they were companies like Blackwater were guarding some NGOs in the region, but we barely ever saw them. So they probably were there doing some BG for NGOs, but I've never seen them. I've never encountered them. As far as I am concerned, they weren't there.
Was the Dutch army at that point well equipped? Does the Dutch army has their own drones, or did you have to rely on the Americans?
When it comes to drones, we relied on the Americans. We used an American drone system, but the communication with those Americans was very bad. We didn't make proper use of drones. We should have, because the drone is a perfect mean to do, for example, a BDA, a battle damage assessment. But the problem is that the Dutch people did not want to do battle damage assessments. That was because there were no true battles. They were just shooting at people, and that could easily have been controlled, the damage, with the use of drones, because you can see freshly dug graves, you can see bomb craters, you can see ruined koalas, the houses where Afghan people lived in. So effectively, we should have done a drone VDA after each shot that we fired, but we didn't. We never used those drones to do proper battle damage assessments, which in itself was wrong. So we had an American unit operating a drone, but we never made proper use of it. I tried to work with those people, and I did so pretty satisfactorily, but I did it on my own. I just went to them, we had coffee, we flew that drone over areas that I knew well, but that was it. The proper intelligence channels didn't properly use the assets they had available drone-wise.
After you left Afghanistan?
Quite honestly, I left in 2008, and the Dutch mission went on. I tried to follow it for another year, but then I simply resigned from the army because I was sent to an army academy in order to become a major. On that academy, I ventilated some thoughts, and on the subject of Afghanistan, I tried to make it a subject we could talk about and properly try to learn from our mistakes, which was not appreciated. Then I found the attitude towards Afghanistan so ridiculous in the end that I resigned and I quit the army.
When did you came back to the Netherlands? Did you ever go back to the Netherlands?
No, I never came back. But I've been traveling all my life. I only spent like 2 years in the army when I was young. In the 80s, I spent 2 years in the army. I got out, and then I traveled the world for 20, 25 years. And then only when the Dutch went back to when the Dutch went to Afghanistan, I joined the army again and spent 2 years in Afghanistan. Then they made me an offer to stay in the army. They sent me to an academy, but the whole ambience of and their way of operating conflicted so much with my values that I said, no, I don't want to be a part of this army anymore. So I quit.
Ask you on your opinion, how did that happen?
Well, there are several things. First of all, I published a book about my first 10 months in Afghanistan. That was published in March 2020. Directly after the book was published, there were questions in Parliament because I just candidly speak about my experiences, and they are not like they don't equal the general narrative about Afghanistan. So there were questions in Parliament. That apart, I got a lot of mails and messages from people that recognized themselves in what I wrote. And some soldiers went so far as to firstly speak out about what they did wrong in Afghanistan. So that led to at least one court case. There's one case being investigated about a soldier that fired on people without having a need to fire on them. So that's being researched now, and quite hopefully that comes to a court case. But that apart, there are some Afghan people that are suing the Dutch government for wrongfully having been bombarded by Dutch forces. And I think they are in their right to sue the government, and I try to assist them with the lawyers that assist them to win their case against the state of the Netherlands, because lots and lots of people have been bombarded and have been killed for no reason at all. And I think that has to be rectified, or at least we have to be honest about it and try to learn from what we did wrong. So I assist those people in their court cases against the state. That apart, we had a situation recently or still have a situation in Afghanistan where Taliban are, well, they just walked into Kabul. So the parliament asked me for my opinion on that subject, and I had meetings and just displayed my views on the situation, which again are different from the state narrative. Point is that I'm in constant contact with Afghan people in and outside of Afghanistan. I'm in contact with Afghan journalists. I'm even in contact with Taliban. Talk to them, check for their opinions, and draw my conclusions only from what I learned from Afghan people and from the situation in Afghanistan and especially in Kabul. And in that capacity, I advised our parliament, but I don't think it was overly appreciated, because they have their state narrative, and well, what I know from Afghanistan contradicts their narrative, and I don't think they're pleased with that. But well, if they want only people that confirm their stories, well, then they shouldn't call me, because I have a different perspective on the situation in Afghanistan.
And what situation do they ask you on your opinion in the Afghan government?
Well, the big problem right now, or at least what they make a problem, for example, is the situation with people that used to work for us. So when we were there from 2006 till 2010, we had Afghan people working for us, some people in the capacity of interpreters. And of course, now there's people say, well, the Taliban is back in charge, so we have to flee the country because we are in danger. Which could very well be, but while I served in Afghanistan, part of my duties was to select interpreters. So I know that all the interpreters that worked for us, they came from Kabul. No one in Kabul knew that they were working as interpreters for us, and they were in no way in any danger. And till today, they are not in danger. So I think it's wrong to focus on saving interpreters, while we should be saving, if we want to save someone, it should be the local Afghan people that emptied our Dixies, the local Afghan people that did our laundry. Those are the people that walked into our base, that walked into Camp Holland on a daily basis, and at the end of the day, they walked home. So everyone in the neighborhood knows that they once worked for us. So if you want to save people, you should save the right people. If you want to get people out of Afghanistan because they are in some kind of danger, you should not make that into a political game. You should be upright about it, and you should go after the people that need our help. And right now it has translated in some sort of political thing, and people are screaming from rooftops that we have to save interpreters. And in my opinion, it's not the interpreters that you have to save. You have to save our local employers at the base. So that was one of the points I made. Another point is that I think it's a wrong thing to judge today's Taliban by their actions of 20 years ago. If you do that, there is no way we could ever get into some sort of communication with those people. And I think it's very important right now that we communicate with them and see if we can establish such a bond with them that we can more or less make them adapt to some friendlier rules for them to apply in Afghanistan. If we alienate them right now by keeping saying that they're horrible people, they are Taliban and responsible for horrible crimes, then we will never have a basis to treat them as maybe equal partners and to give them an opportunity to create something in Afghanistan. And I know from the people I talk to that they are very willing, today's Taliban is very willing to take a different approach than they took 20 years ago. They are willing to make Afghanistan a proper country with economical values, with schools, with they are not backward people. But as long as we treat them that way, and as long as we close every kind of contact or communications with them, we will not progress, because because Taliban is a part of Afghan society, and we have to acknowledge it. And if we don't, we're taking the wrong approach, is what I think.
I'm sorry, it might be a stupid question, but how do you recruit Afghan Dixie toilet and laundry makers in Afghanistan?
You don't recruit them, you just tell someone we are looking for people willing to empty our Dixies, and we're willing to pay money for it. And the next day there are 30 people waiting in front of the gate. And you check them for weapons, you let them in, and you let them do their job. That's how it happened. We just opened our gates for them, and they walked in and they did their job and they got their daily money.
Okay.
So that's it.
And why is it a moral thing to save the translators? Why is that a thing at the moment?
It is a thing because no one knows about the true situation in Afghanistan. You have politicians right now in Holland who have no clue what exactly happened in Afghanistan, and they are not interested to inform themselves. They're just shouting, "We have to save the Terps," and that is a ridiculous thing to do. That only shows that you want to demonstrate that you carry your heart on the right position. But it doesn't do any good to the people that really need our help right now in Afghanistan, which are not the interpreters. And that's the only thing I try to tell people. The interpreters we worked with came from Kabul, and no one in Kabul knew that they were working as interpreters. No one had a vague clue that they were working for us. Local people that we used, it was quite obvious they worked for us because they reported in front of our gate every morning and they walked home every afternoon. So if you're looking for people that are possibly in trouble with the Taliban right now, it's the people that we locally recruited. It's not the Terps. And that's the only thing I want to make clear, or wanted to make clear in Parliament, that it's right now, it's just a political game. And if you're sincere, if you're honest and want to save people, then focus on the right people to save.
Did you what news did you watch? Did you watch any news? But being there 2006, did you have Dutch television?
Well, we had a new system in the army back then, and they called it embedded journalism. So they invited selected journalists to Afghanistan, to Uruzgan, to watch our progress, but those journalists were very controlled, so they could only write what the military allowed them to write, and if they didn't, they would never be invited back to Afghanistan. So there was a very curious situation in which the press basically was fully misled about the whole situation, and the few journalists that really tried to investigate what was really going on, they didn't get any permission to come back to Afghanistan. So in order to be truly informed, the Dutch public was dependent on a few journalists that went to Afghanistan on their own account, and a few did so, not enough, but a few journalists went to Afghanistan by themselves, and they reported a completely different messages than the embedded journalists, which was logical because the embedded journalists were just simply misused to get false information to the public in Holland, which was, in my opinion, a very bad thing to do. If you have embedded journalism, make it truly embedded and give them a chance to properly see what you're doing as a soldier. But we didn't. They were manipulated and controlled in order to just write what the Dutch military wanted them to write. That's not journalism.
And no, but didn't you sit on camp and were you then unsatisfied, or were you just happy with the reporting? I mean, it must have been, as you said, some different to reality to what you have seen on what has been reported by that time.
Everything that was reported conflicted with reality, and it was quite frustrating because I knew that the Dutch public was misinformed. At the same token, I was really scared that even our politicians were misinformed, and they were. So in the end, we very rapidly created a situation in which the Dutch military could basically do whatever they wanted, and there was no control. And that has led to a lot of dead Afghan people. That has led to bombardments. That has led to a lot of violence that should not have been there. I mean, if you have an army like the Dutch army operating in a foreign country without controlling them, things spin out of control very quickly because they're simply not up to the task at hand, and they play their own hand, and that should be controlled by, for example, the press. In the case of Afghanistan, in the case of Uruzgan in 2006 to 2010, the Dutch army was not controlled by anyone. They simply could do as they pleased, and that has led to a very, very undesirable situation. There are lots of things uncovered yet. The problem is that people report to me with their stories, soldiers that have served in Afghanistan. They write me their emails and their ranking from soldier to colonel, giving me their stories and telling me that what I write about Afghanistan is correct. And there are horrifying stories, but those people are still serving. Those people have family. Those people know what they call upon themselves when they speak out. So they don't. They want me to listen to their stories, but at the same time, they don't want to get out with their stories. So far, there has been one soldier that sent me his story, which was a horrifying story. And I talked to him for months. And in the end, he was willing to talk to the press. And he has given his story to the press. And that led to a lot of commotion in the Netherlands, because there is a court case right now going on about his case, because it's being researched. And so it's the first case that's coming out of misconduct of Dutch military in Afghanistan. And with time passing, more cases will come out, and hopefully I've been able to contribute to that in a way. At least people are talking to me, and now it's time. It's waiting for them to have the guts to speak out in public about what they actually did in Afghanistan. But we still have a long time to go, because the government's covering up pretty good, and well, it's kind of a fight. I have a bigger fight right now with the government than I once had in Afghanistan.
What do you want to change in Afghanistan about the military?
Well, first of all, we shouldn't be there. I mean, get out as quickly as possible. We should never have gotten in. I mean, there was a reason to get into Afghanistan. That, of course, had to do with the situation in 2001. But as soon as we solved that situation, we should have let the Afghan people to recover by themselves. We should not have stayed there. We have not, for 20 years, been able to do anything good. We have created a lot of chaos. We have created a lot of unrest. We are responsible for shiploads of dead people. We have disrupted a way of life that should not have been disrupted. I think the actions of 2001, the Operation Anaconda, was justifiable. I understand that. But after that, it was quite successful. It was a successful operation. And after that, we should have retreated, and we should have just helped those countries with whatever we could, but not in a military sense. We could have helped them through NGOs. There are lots of capable organizations able to help people in distress, but there was no distress in Afghanistan. Afghanistan needed to rebuild itself starting 2001. We had dealt a formidable blow to the organization thing called Taliban, and the Afghan people were pretty capable of rebuilding their own life. They didn't need us to help them. And for some reason, we wanted to help them, and well, the result wasn't too good.
How's do you think does the Netherlands deals with veterans? Is it easy to get a job as a veteran when you get home?
Well, there is no problem whatsoever being a veteran. The only thing is that most veterans are being used right now in order to, with hindsight, create a situation in Afghanistan that was not true. I mean, we have an amazing lot of people suffering from PTSD if you compare it to the people that actually left the gates in Afghanistan. I mean, we talked about that earlier. Very few soldiers ever left the gate, and as it turns out, if you look at the numbers, almost 100% of them is suffering from PTSD right now, which is impossible. So in a way, that whole PTSD situation is, in my opinion, misused to create an idea of Afghanistan, to sort of make it into our Vietnam, which it wasn't, because nothing happened. But as long as PTSD veterans are telling their stories that are mostly completely ridiculous stories, we can just dwell in the idea that Afghanistan, Uruzgan was our Vietnam, which is not true. I mean, we simply grossly misbehaved in Afghanistan. But right now, a lot of veterans are being misused by the government allows them to tell stories that are simply untrue, but those stories make it seem like we were fighting an enormous enemy in Uruzgan, which is simply untrue. We did not have an enemy. There was no Taliban there. We misconducted. And right now, lots of people are suffering from moral injuries, which is a completely different thing than PTSD. They know that we were wrong. They know we bombed innocent people. They know we fought with people that had never done us any wrong, and they feel guilty about that. That is often confused with PTSD, and the government sort of embraces that whole PTSD situation, because the more people we have suffering from PTSD, well, the clearer it is that we had an enormous enemy there, and it is not true. So after Uruzgan, there was a very strange situation created with lots of people with horrifying stories that could easily be called untrue, but they are making the image of what our mission once was, and it's a false image, but it sort of justifies the amount of bombs we threw on Afghan people, the amount of grenades we lobbed on them. It's because of those untrue stories, it seemed justifiable what we did then, the amount of ordnance we used, and that's a very strange situation that will one day collapse, because more people are coming out and are willing to tell the truth about Uruzgan.
You probably served in Afghanistan with comrades who also have been in ex-Yugoslavia, in Kosovo, in the Bosnian War. Well, have you ever heard before going to the Netherlands Army about PTSD from this conflict?
Yeah, but it's the same. I mean, I worked in former Yugoslavia in a private function back in the day. So I followed the experiences of the Dutch forces in Yugoslavia quite closely. In my opinion, it's the same situation. Again, we were there with false mandates. I have a problem with the whole concept of PTSD. It's not that I don't say that. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but we're going about it too easily, and we are given it to people too easily, and that creates a wrong idea about what truly happened in a country that we were employed to. I don't know how to say that, but I've talked to many American soldiers who served in Iraq, who served in Afghanistan, and who truly saw action. When I was younger, I had lots of conversations with people that served in Vietnam, and they have been through action that is too unbelievable to even talk about. And they were suffering from PTSD in their own withdrawn way. I accepted that. I felt sorry for them. Right now, we have given PTSD a whole new perspective, and I don't know. I'm not a shrink. I have no right to judge, but I think whether it's people that served in the former Yugoslavia, or people that served Dutch people that served in the former Yugoslavia, or in Afghanistan, we're throwing PTSD around too easily, because there are certain things that you have to experience before being able to.
You didn't mention this, Mr. Norte, that you did work in former Yugoslavia. In what position, and did you work for the government?
I did not work for the government at all those days. I worked for private contractors, and I did my job, which was mainly reconnaissance, just to be there among the people, like I did when I came into Uruzgan. Be among people and report on a situation. That was basically what I did. I collected human intelligence.
Okay, and so, but you didn't really answer the. So, did you hear about PTSD before you went to Afghanistan, and did you hear from Yugoslavia war veterans by then about PTSD?
Very little. I mean, I knew the thing existed, but most of the soldiers that went to Afghanistan, Dutch soldiers, were younger people that had never experienced former Yugoslavia. They were like 19 years old, just fresh in the army. I think the average age of Dutch soldiers operating outside Dutch camps in Afghanistan was like 19 years old. So those soldiers had never experienced the war in former Yugoslavia. There were some older sergeants and officers that had been there, but PTSD among them was not, as far as I know, not an issue. It might have been there, but I never heard about it. No.
And yeah. And what's the situation now in the Netherlands?
What do you mean?
With veterans.
Well, I don't know. I mean, we have veterans in the Netherlands. They are collected or they have assembled in groups. They have an institute that takes care of them. There is a lot of PTSD among them, too much as far as I'm concerned. They make a lot of noise, especially when I speak out. They're very angry with me, or at least a hardcore group among them. But what should I say about them? They gather every year and march through The Hague. I don't. I just don't want to be a part of that community. I think I don't know. It's not my thing. It's not. I think if you have certain experience in life, then embrace them and let them work for you, but don't dwell on them. I mean, life goes on. And if 4 months in Afghanistan, most Dutch soldiers only serve 4 months in Afghanistan, which is not enough to serve there, properly serve there. You should be there for a year, but they serve there 4 months. And if those 4 months are a highlight of your life, I think it's fine. it's all right, but I don't see it that way. It's just, for me, I've been there 2 years, has been a wonderful experience. I mean, truly wonderful. The fights I was in included. I mean, I loved it. Every second that I spent in Afghanistan was just well spent, was wonderful. I loved it. But I don't want to dwell on it. My life continues, and there's more challenges, there's more things to do, and I don't see myself going to The Hague once a year and walk around with other people that probably served in an armored container, call themselves veterans. It's not my thing. So they're very welcome to do whatever they want, but I try to keep my distance and live my life and just cherish Afghanistan as a wonderful experience I had, although I've been busy for 2 years to stop Dutch violence, and in the end I couldn't. I tried to do whatever I could to keep the Afghan people safe, and I failed in that regard. So that's sometimes I think about that, and sometimes I wonder if I could have done anything better. I think I couldn't, but no, I tried to stop the madness, and I couldn't. I was too small a person, too small an entity to change anything. But I tried, and I'm proud of that. It's often that people ask me, tell me something you're proud of, something you're proud of that you did in Afghanistan, and I can't think of anything but one thing, and that's the time that I was in a fight and was tempted to throw a hand grenade and didn't, and put it back in the pouch where I took it from. I mean, that's the single moment I'm proud of, and but that apart, no, it's a part of my life on which I don't want to dwell any longer. It's I enjoyed my time there, and life goes on. Life is wonderful, and there's beautiful things to be done, and that's what I'm doing.
What did your grandfathers tell you about war? Where have they been?
Well, in the family I grew up, there was silence about the war. People suffered, people lost most of their families, but they never talked about it. And I only learned later in life what happened to them. But when it comes to my grandparents, not many of their kin survived the war, and but they were silent about it. They had their experiences, and they were not good. But they took them as life experiences and continued with their lives without too much complaining. Although they had a lot of right to complain, but they didn't, and they lived their lives. But they never shared much with me, so I didn't get much information about the Second World War from them. Although I'm from Rotterdam, and Rotterdam, as you probably know, was quite heavily bombed during the first days of the war, and that's what I remember, just going about on my bicycle through areas that were completely bombarded away. It used to be the inner city of Rotterdam, and it was no longer there. So as a child, you every now and then you felt those reminders of the war, but I mean, it was far away. I was young and I was cheerful, and I didn't think about war, and no one confronted me with it. Although I know now that my family quite suffered during the war, but they never made it a big thing.
My mind is blank. But you, thank you now for now. You very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Norte.